Claire Matthews stood in the center of the grand arena on Centauri Prime, her hands bound with metal restraints that glowed with an eerie blue light. The arena was massive, a structure built thousands of years ago to host celebrations of imperial power. Today it would host her death. The walls rose high above her head and every available space was filled with spectators. Billions more watched through screens and broadcasts across the galaxy. The Galactic Empire wanted everyone to see what happened to those who defied them. The Emperor sat on his throne, elevated above the arena floor so that everyone could see him. His name was Krell the Undying, a title he had earned through centuries of conquest and absolute rule. He was tall, with silver skin that reflected the artificial light of the arena. His eyes were cold and calculating. He had ruled the Empire for over 300 years, and in that time, he had crushed every rebellion, conquered every resistance, and established himself as the most powerful being in the known galaxy. The execution had been announced across all Imperial channels 3 days before. The humans, a young species that had only recently discovered interstellar travel, had sent a diplomatic envoy to the Imperial capital. They wanted peace. They wanted trade agreements. They wanted to be recognized as equals in the galactic community. The Emperor found this request amusing and insulting at the same time. How could such a young species, barely 50 years into space exploration, believe they deserved equality with the Empire? Claire Matthews had been the lead diplomat in that mission. She was 28 years old, born on a colony world called Kepler 452b. She had studied diplomacy for years and believed that words and understanding could bridge any gap. She had believed that all species, no matter how different, could find common ground. When she stepped off the human ship onto the docking platform of Centauri Prime, she felt nervous but hopeful. That hope had lasted exactly 4 hours. The Imperial Guard had arrested her without warning. The other members of her diplomatic team were held in separate cells. No explanation was given. No trial was offered. 3 days later, she was brought to the arena to be executed. The message was clear. The Galactic Empire would not tolerate the ambitions of a young species. Humans needed to be reminded of their place. Claire was led to the center of the arena by guards in black armor. Her heart was racing, but her face remained calm. She had made a decision the night before, sitting alone in her cell. She would not die in fear. She would not die begging for mercy. She would die as herself, standing tall, speaking truth. If this was the last moment she had to influence the galaxy, she would use it wisely. The Emperor leaned forward slightly on his throne. He raised his hand and the entire arena fell silent. Billions of beings across thousands of worlds watched on their screens, waiting to see what would happen next. "You stand here because you dared to challenge the authority of the Galactic Empire." The Emperor's voice echoed through the arena and across all broadcast channels. "You represent a species that has forgotten its place in the cosmic order. Today the universe will be reminded of what happens to those who refuse to submit." Claire took a breath. Her hands were trembling slightly, but when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "My name is Claire Matthews. I am a human being from the planet Earth and the colony world of Kepler 452b. I came here as a diplomat, seeking peace and understanding. That was not a crime. It was an act of hope." The guards moved toward her, ready to execute their orders. But the Emperor raised his hand again, curious. He wanted to hear what this young human woman had to say. After all, her death would be more meaningful if she understood what was happening to her. Claire continued, her voice growing stronger. "You believe that power comes from strength and fear. You believe that obedience must be enforced through pain. But you are wrong. Power that comes from fear is brittle. It breaks easily. Real strength comes from justice, from compassion, and from the belief that all life matters. Humans are young in space, yes, but we are old in spirit. We have learned through our history that the greatest achievements come not from what we destroy, but from what we build together." The Emperor's expression did not change, but something shifted in the arena. Some of the spectators leaned forward, listening to every word. The broadcast signals, which usually carried only filtered content approved by Imperial censors, seemed to carry her words without obstruction. "I am not afraid of death," Claire said, looking directly at the Emperor. "But I am sad for a galaxy that must live under the rule of those who see strength as the only value worth honoring. I am sad for all the species who have been forced to submit, who have been told they are not worthy of freedom. I am sad for you, Emperor Krell, because you have never experienced true connection with another being. You have never known what it feels like to be truly seen and accepted. That is the real poverty in your empire, not the lack of resources or weapons. The Emperor's face darkened with anger. He had heard enough. He stood from his throne and pointed a single finger downward, toward Claire in the arena. "Execute her," he commanded. But something unexpected happened in that moment. The broadcast signal, which should have been terminated the moment the execution began, continued to transmit Claire's words across the galaxy. Later, investigators would discover that a human technician had managed to access the Imperial broadcast system and ensure that the entire execution would be recorded without interruption or censoring. The technician had escaped the broadcast center before anyone even knew what had happened. Claire Matthews died with dignity that day, her final words echoing across the Galactic Empire. Her last message was a simple one. Remember that you matter. Remember that kindness is strength. Remember that freedom is worth fighting for. The execution was over in moments. The guards removed her body from the arena. The Emperor left his throne and departed, believing that the matter was finished. The spectators began to leave as well. Life would return to normal. The young human species would be reminded of their place, and the Galactic Empire would continue to rule for another 1,000 years. But something had changed. The broadcast had spread to regions where the Empire had no control. On distant colonies, in isolated research stations, and in rebel outposts hidden in asteroid fields, beings from dozens of different species watched Claire Matthews face death without fear. They listened to her words. They saw her courage. And for the first time in centuries, they began to believe that the Galactic Empire was not as powerful as it claimed to be. 47 minutes after Claire Matthews took her last breath, humanity would begin their response. The galaxy would never be the same again. The message came through the communication channels on a secure frequency that the Galactic Empire did not monitor. It was a simple message, just 3 words. Claire is gone. Admiral Patricia Holmes received the message in her office aboard the human flagship, the USS Defiant, which orbited a hidden station near the edge of human-controlled space. She had been waiting for this message. Everyone had been waiting, but that did not make it any easier to accept. Patricia Holmes was 56 years old, with short gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent most of her life making difficult decisions. She had spent the last 5 years preparing for this moment. Though she had hoped it would never come, she had hoped that the diplomatic mission would succeed, that peace could be achieved through talking and negotiation. But she had also known, deep in her heart, that the Galactic Empire did not negotiate with young species. The Empire took what it wanted and destroyed what it could not control. She stood up from her desk and walked to the observation window. Beyond the thick glass, she could see the stars burning in the darkness of space. Somewhere out there, the broadcast of Claire's execution was spreading through the galaxy, carried by signals that the Empire could no longer control. The humans had made sure of that. They had people embedded in the Imperial broadcast centers, people who had waited years for their chance to act. Patricia opened a communication channel and spoke into the microphone. All department heads report to the command center in 5 minutes. We are initiating Operation Dawn. Within minutes, the command center was filled with military officers, scientists, engineers, and political leaders. Ambassador Kevin Pierce was there, a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He had been the one who argued most strongly for the diplomatic mission in the first place. Now, with Claire dead, he would help lead humanity through what came next. With him was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the head of Human Technological Development, and General Marcus Sullivan, the commander of ground forces. Claire is gone, Patricia said simply. The broadcast reached everywhere. The entire galaxy saw her courage. Now we move to the next phase. Kevin Pierce nodded slowly. His hands were shaking slightly. We need to be careful, he said. We are young. We are small compared to the Empire. If we act too quickly or too aggressively, they will destroy us completely. They will try to destroy us anyway, Elena Rodriguez said. She was a brilliant woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. But they cannot do it if we are smart about our response. The humans on the inside, the ones who work in the Imperial broadcast centers and military installations, they have provided us with valuable intelligence. The Empire's central command structure is far more fragile than we believed. Patricia pulled up a holographic projection of the Galactic Empire. It showed thousands of star systems, each one connected to the others through communication lines and trade routes. The center of the network was the Nexus, a massive space station that controlled all Imperial communications and military coordination. "The Nexus is our target," Patricia said. "It is the brain of the Empire. If we can reach it and take control of it, even for just a short time, we can send out orders that will confuse their military forces and give us the advantage we need." "How long would we have?" Marcus Sullivan asked. He was a sturdy man with a scarred face and intense gray eyes. He had fought in dozens of conflicts and understood warfare better than anyone else in the room. 47 minutes, Elena said. "That is how long it will take for the Empire to realize what has happened and organize a response. In that time, we need to establish control over the Nexus, send out new orders to Imperial military forces, and activate our allies." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what this meant. They were about to start a war with the most powerful empire in the galaxy. There was no guarantee of success. There was every possibility that humanity would be crushed, that all their preparation and planning would amount to nothing. But there was also no choice. The Galactic Empire had made its position clear by executing Claire Matthews. The age of diplomacy was over. Kevin Pierce stood up. "We need to contact our allies," he said. "The Velkari have agreed to support us if we give them proof that we have a real chance of success. So have the Sithrin and the people of the Kepler Collective. If we coordinate our efforts, we can strike at the Empire from multiple directions." Patricia nodded. "I will send out the signal. We have been preparing for this for years. Every resistance group in the galaxy has been waiting for the right moment. Claire's execution is that moment. Her death will not be meaningless. It will be the spark that lights the fire of freedom across the entire galaxy." Over the next hours, messages were sent out through secret channels. The Velkari, an insectoid species that had been conquered by the Empire centuries ago, received word that humanity was ready to act. The Velkari leaders met in their hive chambers and made their decision. They would send their warships to join the attack on the Nexus. The Sithrin, beings of pure crystalline consciousness who had been enslaved to provide power for Imperial machinery, also agreed to participate. They would use their unique abilities to disrupt the Empire's power systems at critical moments. Scientists and engineers across human space worked frantically to prepare the technology they would need. Weapons were loaded onto ships. Soldiers were briefed on their targets and their objectives. Food and supplies were distributed to the military forces. Everyone understood the importance of what they were about to do. In the days following Claire's execution, Admiral Patricia Holmes stood in the command center and watched as her military forces gathered near the coordinates for their attack. Thousands of ships from dozens of different species began to assemble in a hidden region of space. The Velkari brought their heavy cruisers and fighters. The Sithrin provided their specialized energy weapons. Human ships, built with advanced technology developed over many years, took positions alongside their new allies. Ambassador Kevin Pierce composed a message that would be broadcast to all species in the galaxy once they had seized control of the Nexus. In his message, he spoke of Claire Matthews and her sacrifice. He spoke of the need for freedom and justice. He spoke of the possibility of a new galactic order, one built on cooperation instead of domination. Patricia Holmes looked at the assembled forces and felt a strange mixture of emotions. She was afraid, because she knew that many beings would die in the coming battles. She was sad because she thought of Claire Matthews and what the young diplomat had lost. But she was also filled with hope. For the first time in centuries, someone was standing up to the Galactic Empire. For the first time, the oppressed species of the galaxy had a real chance to break free. "All units, stand by," Patricia said into the communication system. "In 12 hours, we launch Operation Dawn. In 12 hours, the Galactic Empire falls." Around her, officers began their final preparations. Soldiers checked their weapons. Engineers made sure all systems were functioning properly. The galaxy held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The broadcast of Claire's execution had spread everywhere. Her words about justice and compassion and true strength were being discussed on thousands of worlds. People were beginning to believe that change was possible. And then finally the moment came. Admiral Patricia Holmes gave the order that would change the course of galactic history. The forces of freedom began to move toward their target. The Galactic Empire had no idea what was coming. The clock began counting down the moment Claire Matthews took her last breath. 47 minutes. That was all the time Admiral Patricia Holmes and her forces had to strike at the heart of the Galactic Empire and fracture it beyond repair. In the command center aboard the USS Defiant, Patricia stood with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the tactical display that showed thousands of ships beginning their approach toward the Nexus. The Nexus was a space station so massive that it could be seen from light years away. It hung in space like a metallic moon, bristling with weapons and defense systems. For 3,000 years it had been the unquestionable heart of imperial power. Every military command, every political decision, every resource allocation in the entire empire flowed through the Nexus. It was protected by the most advanced defensive systems ever created. The Empire had never seriously considered that it could be attacked. "All Allied forces, begin your assault patterns," Patricia commanded, her voice steady and calm. Around her, officers at dozens of stations worked frantically, monitoring the progress of the attack. The first wave of ships, led by the Valkyrie heavy cruisers, pushed forward through space at incredible speeds. Behind them came human fighters and Scytheran energy vessels. They were heading directly toward the Nexus, and they were moving faster than the Imperial defenses expected. The first laser batteries opened fire from the Nexus's outer defense rings. Brilliant red beams of energy streaked across the darkness of space, lighting up the void like deadly fireworks. The first wave of Valkyrie ships took the brunt of the attack. Their armor was thick and designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault. 3 ships exploded under the heavy fire, their hulls breaching and spilling crew members into the cold vacuum of space. But the rest of the Valkyrie fleet kept moving forward, undeterred and determined. 38 minutes remaining, Elena Rodriguez called out from her station. She was tracking the time with precision. Every second counted. They had exactly 47 minutes before the Empire could reorganize its forces and send reinforcements to defend the Nexus. The Human Strike Force, led personally by Admiral Patricia Holmes aboard the USS Defiant, moved in from a different angle. They had studied the Nexus's defensive patterns for years, thanks to intelligence provided by human operatives embedded deep within the Imperial system. They knew exactly where the defensive systems were weakest. The USS Defiant fired a barrage of advanced missiles, each one carrying sophisticated technology, designed specifically to disrupt the Nexus's shield generators. 3 of the missiles found their targets. Explosions bloomed across the station's surface and the protective shields flickered. In that moment of weakness, the entire Allied fleet poured through, bringing a storm of weapons fire that the Nexus had never faced before. The station's commanders tried to compensate, tried to redirect power to reinforce the damaged sections, but they were overwhelmed by the coordinated assault. 30 minutes remaining, Elena announced. On the surface of the Nexus, things were descending into chaos. The station had been designed to repel external threats, but it had been designed by military planners who had never truly believed an external threat could reach them. Soldiers ran through corridors trying to understand what was happening. Officers shouted orders that conflicted with other orders coming from different command centers. The communication systems began to jam as the Allied forces increased their electronic warfare. Attacks. Patricia Holmes watched the tactical display as the first boarding pods were launched toward the Nexus. These pods carried elite human soldiers trained specifically for this mission. They were the best warriors humanity had produced, and they had one objective: reach the central command hub and take control of the station's communication systems. The pods attached themselves to the station's hull with magnetic clamps. Soldiers in full combat armor poured out, moving with precision and speed. They fought through Imperial guards in zero-gravity corridors, their superior tactical training giving them an advantage despite being outnumbered. The humans had trained for this for years. They knew every layout, every pathway through the Nexus. The Imperial guards, accustomed to facing enemies they could easily dominate, found themselves fighting enemies they could not defeat. 20 minutes remaining, Elena said, her voice urgent now. The Scytheran forces were doing something even more remarkable. They were beings of pure energy, and they had the ability to interface directly with the Nexus's power systems. Scytheran consciousness merged with the station's computer networks, searching for the central command hub's location and sending interference that confused the Imperial computer systems. Entire sections of the Nexus went dark as power was redirected and rerouted, by the Scythran infiltrators. In the command center of the Nexus, the commanders were beginning to realize they were facing their final moments. The station was being overwhelmed. The shields were failing. The defensive weapons were misfiring because the Scythran had corrupted the targeting systems. And then suddenly a human soldier appeared in their command center, advancing through the final line of guards with a weapon in one hand and a communication device in the other. "This is Colonel Daniel Foster of the Human Strike Force," the soldier announced. "The Nexus is now under our control. All Imperial forces stand down." It was a bluff. The command center was not fully under their control yet. But the Imperial commanders, faced with this display of overwhelming force and terrified by what had just happened, made the choice to surrender rather than continue fighting. Within minutes, the entire command hub of the Nexus was secured by human and allied forces. 10 minutes remaining, Elena called out. Patricia Holmes leaned forward in her chair. "Begin broadcasting the new orders." From the Nexus, signals went out across the entire Galactic Empire. These were not orders from Emperor Krell. These were orders from a new authority, one that had just seized the heart of Imperial power. The orders told Imperial military forces in different regions to stand down. The orders told governors and administrators to cease their normal operations and await new instructions. The orders told the entire Empire that something fundamental had changed. And then, something happened that the Empire had not experienced in thousands of years. No orders came back from the central authority to override these new commands. There were no countermanding instructions. The silence from the normal chain of command was deafening. Local commanders, accustomed to receiving guidance from above, suddenly found themselves making decisions on their own. Some chose to follow the new orders. Others chose to attempt resistance. Still others chose to negotiate. The Empire, which had been unified under a single chain of command for 3,000 years, began to fracture into regional powers. Without the central coordination that the Nexus provided, the vast military empire could not function as a single entity. Garrison commanders in distant regions began hoarding resources for their own defense. Trade routes became chaotic as local governments started controlling commerce themselves. The bureaucratic structure that had held everything together collapsed not from direct military assault, but from the simple loss of central authority. 5 minutes remaining, Elena said quietly. The Emperor's palace on Centauri Prime was under assault. Velkari ground forces, transported to the Imperial capital by human ships, were fighting through the Emperor's personal guard. They had instructions to capture the Emperor alive if possible. For centuries, the Velkari had been enslaved by the Empire. Now they had a chance for vengeance, but Ambassador Kevin Pierce had asked them to show mercy. He had asked them to prove that the new galactic order would be different from the old one. The Velkari warriors, remembering Claire Matthews' words about justice and compassion, honored this request. Emperor Krell stood on his balcony, watching his empire crumble. He could not believe what was happening. The Galactic Empire, which he had ruled for 300 years, which had seemed eternal and unchangeable, was falling apart. And it had taken only the execution of one young human woman and 47 minutes of coordinated action from his enemies. 1 minute remaining, Elena announced. By the time the 47-minute window closed, the Galactic Empire no longer existed as a unified political entity. Emperor Krell was in custody awaiting trial. The Nexus was under Allied control. And across thousands of worlds, beings who had lived their entire lives under the boot of Imperial rule were beginning to believe that freedom was possible. Patricia Holmes sat back in her chair and allowed herself to take a breath. Around her, officers were celebrating, but she could not join them. She thought of Claire Matthews, of the young diplomat whose courage had made all of this possible. Her execution had been meant to break humanity's spirit. Instead, it had changed the entire galaxy. The halls of what had once been the Imperial Palace were now the temporary headquarters of the new galactic government. Ambassador Kevin Pierce walked through these halls with a feeling of unreality. Just weeks ago, these same corridors had been patrolled by Imperial guards loyal to Emperor Krell. Now they were filled with humans. Velkari, Scythran, and representatives from a dozen other species that had suffered under Imperial rule. The power had shifted so suddenly that sometimes it felt like a dream. Kevin was 62 years old, with dark skin and kind eyes that had seen much suffering in his lifetime. He had been born on a colony world that had been destroyed when he was young. He had spent his entire life working toward peace and understanding between species. He had watched his friend and colleague Claire Matthews go to her death with courage. And now, against all odds, he had been given the chance to build something better. He entered the main negotiation chamber, a vast room with high ceilings and walls that had been decorated with the symbols of imperial power. The first thing the new government had done was remove those symbols and replace them with something different. In the center of the room was a symbol created by all the allied species working together. It showed beings of different forms and shapes standing together, united in purpose. Around the negotiation table sat the leaders of the Alliance of Free Worlds. There was Queen Jothur of the Velkari, whose chitinous body reflected the light in shades of green and gold. Next to her was Consciousness Prime of the Sithran, a being of pure crystalline structure who communicated through vibrations that everyone could understand through translation devices. There were leaders from the Kepler Collective, the Andorian Federation, and dozens of other worlds and species. "We have received the formal surrender of the outer territories," said General Marcus Sullivan, who was now serving as the military coordinator for the new Galactic Order. "The commanders there have agreed to stand down their forces and allow transition governments to be established. They are choosing cooperation over resistance." This was the new reality. The Galactic Empire had been so vast and so rigid in its structure that when the central command fell, it could not be put back together again. Local governors and military commanders suddenly found themselves with real power for the first time in centuries. Some of them had chosen to fight back, but most had chosen to negotiate and cooperate with the new order that was being established. Kevin Pierce looked at the representatives around the table. "The most important thing we do now is establish a system that protects everyone's rights. The old empire ruled through fear and domination. We must show that a different way is possible. We must prove that cooperation is stronger than control." Queen Jothur made a clicking sound that her translator converted to words. "The Velkari have waited centuries for this moment. But we must be careful. Revenge is a poison that only damages the one who drinks it. We must seek justice, not vengeance." Kevin nodded slowly. Everyone in the room understood what she meant. Throughout the galaxy, there were beings who had suffered under imperial rule. Many of them wanted to hurt the ones who had hurt them. It would have been easy to simply execute the Emperor and all his followers, to erase them from history as they had tried to erase so many others. But Kevin had made a promise in his heart and to the memory of Claire Matthews that they would do things differently. "We will hold a trial," Kevin said. "A fair trial where evidence is presented and the accused has a chance to speak. We will show the galaxy that justice does not require cruelty. We will show that we are better than those who came before us." The announcement of Emperor Krell's trial was broadcast across the galaxy. News networks that had once been controlled by the imperial government were now independent, free to report the truth. On thousands of worlds, beings gathered to watch as the trial began in a great amphitheater on Centauri Prime. The former seat of imperial power, Emperor Krell was brought before the tribunal dressed in simple clothing, his hands unbound. It was a stark contrast to the elaborate robes and crown he had worn before. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the loss of power. He sat in a chair facing the judges who represented all the species that had suffered under his rule. The trial lasted for weeks. Witnesses came forward to describe the atrocities they had witnessed. A Velkari worker spoke about the conditions in the mines where her people had been forced to labor for decades. A member of the Sithran Collective described being forced to provide energy for the Emperor's weapons without their consent. Victims from dozens of worlds told their stories of loss and suffering. But something remarkable happened during the trial. It was not just a display of punishment. It was a display of truth. Everyone, including those who were loyal to the old empire, had to hear what had actually happened. They had to face the reality of what their system had created. Some of them changed their minds about the old order. Some of them, for the first time, understood the damage that had been done in the name of imperial power. Elena Rodriguez, the scientist who had helped plan the assault on the Nexus, worked with other leaders to establish a new system of governance. It was based on the principle that all species had equal value and equal voice. Each species would have representation in a council of worlds. No single species could dominate the others. Decisions would be made through discussion and voting, not through the command of an all-powerful ruler. This new system was not perfect. There were disagreements about how resources should be distributed. There were arguments about trade policies and defense strategies, but these disagreements were handled through conversation and negotiation, not through violence and coercion. For the first time in galactic history, beings from different species found themselves truly working as partners, rather than as master and servant. As the trial continued, Emperor Krell sat in his simple chair and watched his world fall apart. He listened to the accusations against him. He heard the stories of suffering. He was finally brought to understand the full extent of what his rule had done to countless beings across the galaxy. In his final statement, he did not deny the charges. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply acknowledged that he had been wrong, that his system had been built on injustice, and that he deserved punishment. The tribunal found him guilty of crimes against countless beings and countless species. But when the sentence was delivered, it was not death. It was life imprisonment on a remote world, where he would have time to reflect on what he had done. This decision shocked many beings in the galaxy. Those who had suffered most under his rule questioned whether this was true justice. But Kevin Pierce insisted that this was the right choice, that executing the Emperor would not bring back those who were lost, and that mercy was a sign of true strength. The establishment of the Alliance of Free Worlds was celebrated across the galaxy. For the first time, beings from different species worked together not out of fear, but out of genuine shared purpose. Trade flourished. Scientific knowledge was shared freely. Young scholars from Velkari hives studied alongside humans and Sithran, and members of 100 other species. Schools and universities were established throughout known space to teach beings about cooperation and understanding. 4 years after the fall of the Galactic Empire, the Galactic Academy was opened on Earth itself. It became a symbol of the new order, a place where young leaders from all species could come to learn together. The Academy was built on the site where Claire Matthews had been honored with a memorial. Every student who attended would pass by that memorial and remember the sacrifice that had made their education possible. Kevin Pierce, now the coordinator of the Alliance of Free Worlds, often walked through the halls of the Academy and watched the young students of all species learning and growing together. He thought of Claire Matthews and felt a deep gratitude for the sacrifice she had made. Her death, which had been intended to break the spirit of humanity, had instead become the foundation of a new galactic civilization built on justice, cooperation, and the belief that all life had value. 15 years had passed since the fall of the Galactic Empire. Ambassador Kevin Pierce sat in his office in the Galactic Coordination Center, looking out at the stars through a transparent window. His hair was now completely white, and his face was marked by the years of difficult decisions and hard work that had come with building a new civilization. He was old now, much older than he had felt in those frantic days when the Empire was collapsing. But he was satisfied. He could feel it in his bones, the knowledge that he had helped build something good. On his desk was a photograph. It showed Claire Matthews smiling, her face full of life and hope. The photograph had been taken years ago, before the diplomatic mission, before the execution. Kevin picked it up often and looked at it, remembering the young woman who had changed the entire galaxy with her courage. He thought about how different things would be if she had lived, if the diplomatic mission had succeeded. But he also knew that her sacrifice had been necessary. Without her final words, spoken with such dignity and truth in the face of death, the galaxy might never have found the courage to rise up against the Empire. The Galactic Academy had grown far beyond what anyone had imagined. It now had campuses on 20 different worlds, each one designed to accommodate the unique needs of different species. The main campus on Earth had expanded to include dormitories, research facilities, and gathering places where students from all backgrounds could meet and share ideas. Every year, thousands of young beings arrived to study there, eager to learn and to be part of something larger than themselves. On this particular day, Kevin was preparing to address the graduating class of the Galactic Academy. He walked through the campus, greeting students and faculty members as he passed. A group of young Velkari warriors showed him their final project, a detailed study of how the new galactic defense systems worked. A Sithran consciousness asked him questions about the philosophical foundations of the Alliance of Free Worlds. A human student from a distant colony world told him that she wanted to become a diplomat. Inspired by the stories of Claire Matthews, the graduation ceremony took place in the Great Hall, a massive building that could hold tens of thousands of people. The seats were filled with students, teachers, families, and government officials from across known space. The ceremony began with a moment of silence to honor those who had been lost in the final days of the Empire and in the conflicts that had followed its collapse. Pierce stood at the podium and looked out at the young faces before him. They represented hundreds of different species. Some had skin that shimmered with metallic colors. Some were beings of pure energy contained in physical forms by technology. Some looked almost human, while others were so different from humans that it was difficult for ordinary people to recognize them as living beings. But they all shared something in common. They all believed that peace was possible. They all believed that cooperation was stronger than conflict. 15 years ago, Kevin began, his voice carrying through the Great Hall, the Galactic Empire fell. It did not fall because we had better weapons. It did not fall because we had greater resources. It fell because a young woman named Claire Matthews showed the galaxy something more important than power or strength. She showed us courage. She showed us dignity. She showed us that there are things worth standing for, even when standing cost you everything. He paused and looked at the photograph of Claire that was projected on the large screen behind him. Thousands of beings in the hall could see her face, see the calm determination in her eyes. Claire Matthews was a diplomat. She came to the imperial capital seeking peace. For her hope and her kindness, she was executed. But her last words were heard across the galaxy. Her courage inspired millions of beings to believe that change was possible. And because of her, we stand here today in a galaxy that is freer, more just, and more united than it has ever been. The ceremony continued with the honoring of outstanding students and the announcement of scholarship awards. But the most important moment came at the end, when each graduating student was given a small crystal pendant. Each pendant contained a recording of Claire Matthews' final words. Every graduate of the Galactic Academy received one of these pendants. They would carry it with them as a reminder of what Claire had taught the galaxy through her sacrifice. After the ceremony, Kevin returned to his office. He sat in his chair and thought about everything that had changed in 15 years. The trade between different worlds had quadrupled. Scientific advancement had accelerated as researchers from different species worked together and shared knowledge. There had been conflicts, certainly. There had been disagreements that sometimes became violent. But nothing compared to the oppression and control that had existed under the Empire. A young human woman entered Kevin's office. Her name was Sarah, and she was one of the new coordinators working for the Alliance of Free Worlds. She carried a report in her hands. "The reports are in from all the outlying regions," Sarah said. "The new transition governments have been established successfully on 43 different worlds. Resources are being distributed fairly. People are beginning to feel like they have a voice in their own future for the first time in generations." Kevin nodded. This had been one of the greatest challenges of the past 15 years. The fall of the Empire had left a power vacuum. Establishing new governments that served the needs of the people rather than the interests of a single ruler had required patience, wisdom, and constant work. But it was working. Slowly but surely, the galaxy was learning how to govern itself without the boot of a tyrant pressing down on their necks. "There is something else," Sarah said. She pulled up a holographic projection that showed data from across the Alliance of Free Worlds. Violence is down by 87%. Trade is up by 230%. Educational opportunities have increased by 345%. By every measure we can think of, the quality of life for beings across the galaxy is improving. Kevin looked at the numbers and felt the weight of his years lift slightly. This was the legacy he wanted to leave. Not monuments or statues, not power or prestige, simply the knowledge that he had helped create a better world for the beings who would come after him. Years continued to pass. Kevin Pierce eventually retired from his position as the Galactic Coordinator, though he remained active in advising the new leaders who took his place. He spent his final years writing about the history of the transition from the Galactic Empire to the Alliance of Free Worlds. His memoirs became required reading in every school and university across known space. Young beings learned about the old empire, about its cruelty and oppression, and about how it had been brought down by people who believed that change was possible. On the world of Kepler 452b, where Claire Matthews had been born, a great memorial was constructed. It was not a statue of Claire, because the leaders of the new galactic order had decided that the most meaningful memorials were not monuments of stone and metal. Instead, it was a living memorial. It was a garden where beings from all species could come to reflect and remember. At the center of the garden was a pool of still water with the words of Claire's final speech, inscribed on stones around its edge. The age of the Galactic Empire had ended. In its place had risen something new, something better. It was an age of cooperation, of shared growth, of beings from different worlds and different forms working together to build a future where all life had value and dignity. Kevin Pierce died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 97. Millions of beings across the galaxy mourned his passing, but they did not mourn for long. Instead, they celebrated his life and the legacy he had helped create. Schools were named after him. Scholarships were established in his honor. But the greatest tribute was simply the continuation of the work he had started. The galaxy moved forward into a future that Claire Matthews had made possible through her sacrifice. Young beings studied science and philosophy and history, learning from each other across the boundaries of species. Trade routes that had once carried only the goods that the Empire demanded now carried the hopes and dreams of a free people. The universe was still vast and dangerous and full of mysteries. But for the first time in thousands of years, beings across the galaxy faced it together, united in the belief that cooperation was stronger than dominance, that justice was more powerful than fear, and that the sacrifice of one brave young woman could change the destiny of entire worlds. 25 years after the fall of the Galactic Empire, Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood in a research facility on the planet Sirius 7, observing something that would have been impossible in the old days. A team of human scientists worked alongside Velkari engineers and Sithran consciousness specialists on a project that none of them could have completed alone. They were building a device that would allow ships to travel faster than light in ways that had never been possible before. The collaboration between species had unlocked technological secrets that each species had kept hidden from the others for centuries. Elena was now 84 years old, but her mind remained sharp and active. She had dedicated her life to scientific advancement and to the principle that knowledge should be shared freely among all beings. Under the old empire, such cooperation would have been forbidden. The empire had believed that knowledge was power, and power must be controlled by the center. Different species had been prevented from sharing their discoveries with each other. Entire fields of science had been suppressed because they might make a subject species too strong or too independent. Now, everything was different. Elena walked through the research facility and saw boards filled with mathematical equations, written in languages from a dozen different species. She saw models and prototypes that represented hundreds of hours of collaboration. This was the real future that Claire Matthews had died to make possible. It was not about military dominance or political control. It was about the advancement of knowledge and the improvement of life for all beings across the galaxy. A young human researcher named David approached Elena with excitement in his eyes. "Dr. Rodriguez, we have made a breakthrough. The Sithran have found a way to solve the energy problem that was stopping us. If their solution works with our design, we can complete the prototype ahead of schedule." Elena smiled. 30 years ago, this kind of cooperation would have seemed like a fantasy. The Sithran were beings of pure energy, and humans were biological creatures. Their very nature seemed to make them incompatible. But through patient work and genuine desire to understand each other, they had found common ground. The Sithran had learned that humans valued creativity and ingenuity. Humans had learned that Sithran consciousness operated on principles that transcended physical form. Together, they had created something neither species could have created alone. Meanwhile, on the world of Centauri Prime, a very different kind of work was taking place. The former Imperial Palace had been transformed into a museum and educational center. Visitors from across the galaxy came to walk through its halls and learn about the history of the Empire. But the museum was not a celebration of imperial power. Instead, it told the story of oppression and liberation. It documented the lives of those who had suffered under imperial rule. It explained how a system built on dominance and fear had eventually collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. In a private chamber within the museum, a young Velkari named Jelka stood looking at artifacts from the old empire. Jelka was 16 years old and had been born after the fall of the empire. She had never known slavery, She had been raised in a world where Velkari could make their own choices and pursue their own dreams. But she wanted to understand what her people had endured. She wanted to know the history that had shaped the galaxy she lived in. A human guide approached her and began to explain the exhibits. The guide was patient and respectful, answering all of Jelka's questions without judgment. This too was part of the new galactic order. Young beings were taught to understand history not as a collection of facts to be memorized, but as stories of real people and real suffering. They were taught to see themselves as part of a larger community of species, each with their own history and their own perspective. Jelka asked the guide about Claire Matthews. She had heard the name many times, but she wanted to understand the person behind the name. The guide explained how Claire had come to the Empire seeking peace, how she had faced her execution with courage, and how her final words had inspired a galaxy to rise up against tyranny. Jelka listened carefully and felt a deep sense of gratitude toward this human woman she had never met. On Earth itself, in the city where the Galactic Academy had its main campus, a new statue was being unveiled. But it was not a statue of any political leader or military commander. It was a statue of Claire Matthews, created by an artist who was part Velkari and part human. The statue showed Claire standing tall, her face calm and determined, her eyes looking forward into the future. The inscription beneath the statue read simply, "She stood for freedom. Her sacrifice changed everything." Thousands of beings gathered for the unveiling ceremony. Admiral Patricia Holmes, now retired and quite old, stood with Ambassador Kevin Pierce's daughter, a woman named Monica who had devoted her life to education and peace-building. Together they unveiled the statue. As it was revealed, the crowd was silent for a moment, and then they began to applaud. The applause grew louder and louder, a sound of respect and gratitude that seemed to echo across the entire planet. Monica Pierce spoke to the crowd about her father's work and his belief that Claire's sacrifice had not been meaningless. She talked about how her father had spent his final years trying to ensure that future generations would remember what Claire had died for. She spoke about the importance of standing up for justice and compassion, even when it was difficult. She spoke about the galaxy that had been born from Claire's courage. In a research lab on a different world, a team of scientists was studying an ancient mystery. They had discovered evidence that before the Galactic Empire, there had been other civilizations that had risen to greatness. These civilizations had also faced the same choice that the Galactic Empire had faced. Would they build their society on domination or on cooperation? Every single one of them had chosen domination, and every single one of them had eventually collapsed under the weight of their own oppression. The scientists were presenting their findings to the Council of Worlds. They wanted to suggest that the new galactic order establish educational programs across all worlds to teach young beings about these ancient civilizations. They wanted beings to understand that the choice between domination and cooperation was not new. It was an eternal choice that every society had to make. The Council of Worlds approved the proposal unanimously. Within a few years, every school and university in the Alliance of Free Worlds was teaching about the ancient civilizations and the patterns of history. Young beings were learning that the path their galaxy was taking was not inevitable. It was a choice that had to be made, renewed and defended by every generation. Back in the research facility where Elena Rodriguez worked, the prototype was finally completed. The device that would allow faster-than-light travel was ready for testing. But before they activated it, the entire team gathered together. Humans, Velkari, Sithran, and members of 5 other species stood together, united in their commitment to scientific advancement and cooperation. Elena stood before the device and thought about Claire Matthews. She thought about how the young diplomat's final words had set in motion a chain of events that had led to this moment. 47 minutes had changed the galaxy. But it was the subsequent years of hard work, of building new systems, of learning to cooperate and respect each other, that had made the real difference. Elena placed her hand on the activation panel. "This device represents what we can accomplish when we work together," she said to the assembled team. "Every species has contributed knowledge and skill. Every species has had their ideas heard and valued. This is the true power that comes from freedom and cooperation." The device activated, and a beam of energy shot across the facility, opening a stable tunnel through space that would allow ships to travel great distances in just hours instead of weeks. The experiment was a success. The team erupted in cheers, but more importantly, they looked at each other with pride and mutual respect. They had accomplished something extraordinary, not because one species was stronger than another, but because together, they were stronger than any of them could be alone. This was the legacy that Claire Matthews had made possible. This was the future she had died to create. In a galaxy that had once been ruled by fear and domination, beings were now learning to work together, to share knowledge, and to build a future based on cooperation and mutual respect. The age of the Empire had ended, and the age of freedom had truly begun.